Welcome to The Writing Life, the podcast for anyone who writes. My name is Peggy.
And my name is Steph.
And we're speaking to you from the National Centre for Writing, or home in the heart of Norwich, UNESCO City of Literature.
Before we move on to the main portion of today's episode, we wanted to take a moment to tell you about a special opportunity we have coming up to support children and young people to discover the joy of reading and creative writing. National Centre for Writing is taking part in the Big Give Arts for Impact 2026, which is a week-long match funding campaign running between the 17th and the 24th of March 2026. We aim to raise £1,500 in donations, which will be doubled to £3,000 to support NCW's work with children and young people. And what better time, Peggy, to be doing this than in the National Year of Reading?
No better time, Steph. This is such an exciting campaign and an opportunity for us. It will enable us to ignite a lifelong love of words, giving over 4,000 young people opportunities to enjoy reading and writing for pleasure through year-round activities for schools, children and young people. And it isn't just about reading, writing or books, of course. This is about lifelong skills. It's about building confidence, unlocking imagination, increasing empathy and understanding of the world, and boosting well-being. So it's a deeply exciting moment.
Yeah, I think lots of people might not realise that, setting children up, young people up with an enjoyment of reading, it sets them up for life really, doesn't it?
Totally does, absolutely does. And to think that for every £1 that gets given, we get two. I mean, that's absolutely lush.
It's amazing. So if you'd like to support us during this brilliant campaign, please do follow us on @WritersCentre on Instagram and Blue Sky, or subscribe to our newsletter, and we will let you know when the campaign launches on the 17th of March. As Peggy said, every donation made during this 1-week window will be doubled. Double the donation, double the difference. Thank you so much for helping us to empower children and young people with the lifelong benefits of reading and writing for pleasure.
Back to today's episode, where we welcome novelist, poet and Associate Professor of Creative Writing, Sam Meekings. Sam is here to talk about the process behind writing his latest book, Wonder and Loss, a practical memoir for writing about grief, which interweaves memoir and his personal journey through grief with practical guidance and insight on how to write about it.
Sam is a British novelist and poet. He's the author of Under Fishbone Clouds and the Afterlives of Doctor Gachet. He currently works as an Associate Professor of Creative Writing at Northwestern University in Qatar, and has spent the last few years living and working in China and the Middle East. He balances his time between teaching, research, raising 2 kids as a single father, and drinking copious cups of tea. Just like you, Peggy Hughes.
Just like me. Oh, lovely. I love tea. Tea revives. Sam sat down with Steph, maybe with a cup of tea in the frame, for a candid and insightful discussion about writing as therapy, the importance of intention and of setting boundaries, the role of vulnerability, and of embracing the unknown when undertaking a writing project which draws upon lived, painful experiences. There is also, though, lots of room for wonder, magic and play. So let's hand over now to Sam Meekings and our very own Steph McKenna for conversation.
Sam, welcome to The Writing Life. It's such a pleasure to have you with us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
And we're here to talk about your book, Wonder and Loss, a practical memoir for writing about grief, which was published last year, I think?
Yes, November.
Excellent. Well, I've had a read of it recently, and it's remarkable, really. It's this braided memoir which interweaves your personal journey through grief after the passing of your brother, but it also provides a step-by-step guide for anyone who wants to write about their own unique experiences. And you call it both an invitation and a guidebook to forge a way through grief. Before we dive into more detail, I wanted to start with you because you approach grief in this book both as a curious scholar and as a grieving brother. And I was interested in that, in the chronology of how you came to that. So did your academic work, you've got an interest in sort of grief and grief narratives, haven't you?
Yeah, I do. And, I think they came together probably from the beginning, but it was only in putting this book together that I realized why I've been so interested in these things for so long. My brother did not die recently. He died quite a few years ago. And at the time, I was completely unable to process what I was going through. I was unable even to talk about it, to be honest. It was so shocking and dumbfounding and emotionally overwhelming to me that I couldn't even begin to articulate what I was feeling and separate out all those different emotions, the longing and the rage and the anger and the sadness and the disappointment and the regret and all of those different strands. And it was certainly in the many weeks after the funeral for my brother, people would invite me to go out and, have a coffee, meet up. And I kept making excuses because I thought if people ask me how I'm feeling, how am I doing, I'm going to break down, I'm going to lose control because I won't be able to speak about it. Nonetheless, at the same time, I did find myself drawn to memoirs, especially books about grief, novels as well, but I was particularly drawn to people writing about their experiences of grief. And I did get a bit of comfort from them. And that was my way in as a scholar, if you like, to over the years begin studying that side and thinking, okay, there's something really interesting about the way these memoirs work and about the way trauma and grief in particular as a trauma is explored and worked through and performed to a certain extent through writing about it. And that led to a lot of academic research and a lot of academic study. But if you'd asked me while I was doing all of that, I think I probably would have said, well, this is just a fascinating area for me. And I think I would have tried to, make a dispassionate and objective argument that, no, this is just a really interesting area of scholarship. And now looking back, I think, well, of course, I was drawn to it because of my own experiences. But I didn't, or I couldn't see that at the time. So it was those kind of twin areas, I suppose, my own experience of grief, but also my own growing interest in kind of grief work and the literature around the intersections between grief and writing that bit by bit drew me towards writing this book.
And was this book did you always intend for it to be that kind of hybrid between your own personal memoir and a practical writing guide? Or did you ever imagine maybe writing something more traditional?
Yeah, I suppose I did imagine writing something more traditional, definitely. It was only, I suppose, quite late in the process that this idea came to me. I mean, I started writing about my own experience of grief and about my brother, say probably about 3 months after he died. It just got to a point, as I said, I was unable to speak about how I was feeling, and I didn't feel able to bring that up, and I didn't want to burden other people with it. And, I was grieving my brother a lot, and I knew that if I was feeling so much pain, I knew my parents would be feeling even worse. So I didn't bring it up to anybody. And it got to a point where I can't remember what sparked it, but I started writing to my brother. And I wrote these short letters, partly kind of updating him, I suppose, on what was happening around us, and partly haranguing him a little bit and saying, how dare you? How could you have left us all behind?
Yeah.
And that became a really useful way for me to I suppose, articulate and process how I was feeling. And the more I wrote to him, the more I found myself also writing about him and writing about our experiences together, because it had been the case that he was very much someone who loved where we grew up in West Sussex. He stayed there, his whole life until he died very young at 24. I'd left to go to university, and then I'd gone traveling off to China and exploring. And so we lived very different lives. And when we met up again, when I went back home, we'd always kind of reminisce and go back over those shared adventures and scrapes and mishaps we'd got into as kids. And I found myself also thinking, well, what happens to that shared history if I don't have him to talk about it with? If we're not meeting up and having a coffee or a pint and going over those stories, what's going to happen to that history of our childhood, of all our adventures? I thought, well, I've got to write it down before, year by year, they become a little more blurry. So my writing kind of grew from writing to him to writing about him, and kind of processing both my grief that way, but also trying to preserve something of him. For me, at first, I had, the first big bulk of this writing, I had no intention of letting anyone else read it, not my parents, not, anyone close to me, and certainly no one in the kind of wider world. And I wrote and I wrote and I wrote. And it was only, after a little bit of time and maybe a little bit of critical distance that I looked at all of it and thought, there's something else there that's interesting, I think. And at the same time, I was, as I said, doing that scholarly work, and I'd, begun working as a lecturer of creative writing and exploring writing and grief, writing and trauma, these intersections that really interest me. And I thought, well, is there a way to make all that I've kind of learned from this scholarly research a little more accessible to people who may not be that interested in the theory of grief or the theories of narratology in grief, but may actually be going through grief themselves and maybe, like me, looking for a way to articulate and process that through writing. And it was that made me think, okay, if I do this, if I write the research in a slightly more accessible way, I'm going to have to model it in some way. It's very easy to say, okay, well, this is what you've got to try, and this is one way forward, and this is one option. In a kind of abstract way, it's very hard to understand. So I had to think, well, I've got to share my story and my struggles and my pain and how I approached some of these issues and how I grappled with some of these problems in order to show what it might look like, in order to have a kind of leap off point. And that's how I kind of came back to all the writing I'd done and drew from these kind of many, many pages and countless files on my laptop to make it fit, I suppose, the structure of the book, where each chapter explores, a different way in or a different strategy, if you like.
Yeah, so you started with your personal segments and then went back and added in the theory and the writing prompts and the personal reflections in a way that sort of gently guides the reader and the audience through, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. But I also had, I suppose, an idea in my mind that potentially it could be read in, 2 or 3 different ways. You can read the whole book, read my journey, my story of my grief, of losing my brother and how I got through that. And then, read the theory and read the prompts and try them out yourself. You could, if you're just interested in the memoir, just read the first section of each chapter, read it as a traditional memoir. If you're not that interested in my personal experience, that's, that's absolutely fine. And you could just read the theory and the prompts and just use it wholly as a set of writing prompts. So I think there's many ways you could grapple with the book, I suppose.
And the book doesn't just teach craft, does it? It also, as you say, sort of explores the therapeutic potential of writing through pain and loss. It's very mindful of that. Why do you think we feel such a strong urge to sort of document our hardest experiences like that? What are we sort of reaching for when we put those moments into words?
Yeah, I think it's part of the fundamental human experience, I guess. When the book came out in November, I did a few different readings, and I'm still doing a few around the country. And one person at one of these readings said to me, well, death makes storytellers of all of us, because that's our, I think, instinctive response to share those stories, to keep those stories alive, because through telling those stories, we're remembering, we're celebrating, we're preserving something of the people that we've lost. We're keeping that connection with them alive, I think, through talking about them or writing about them, through telling their stories. It keeps them with us. It keeps that kind of link working. I mean, that was certainly true for me. I I took great pleasure in writing a lot of these memories and experiences. There is pain involved, of course, but I was very adamant that I wanted the title to have some positive element as well, wonder and loss, not just, loss or sadness and loss or grief and loss, because there is joy in remembering, in telling those stories, in kind of reanimating and keeping alive all of that. And I felt almost, my brother standing looking over my shoulder as I typed at some points, as though he was there with me. I felt that connection between us strengthened by the writing, and I wanted to share that. I didn't want it to be a kind of guide to craft in terms of, okay, if you want to have a published story or a published memoir, this is what you should do. I wanted something more in keeping, I suppose, with how writing was helpful for me and how it's been helpful for many, many other people, as I've seen through my research, which is, as something meant for ourselves that maybe we may consider sharing later on and publishing and bringing out into the world. But that's not the primary goal. It's that we have, a means of processing and articulating our grief in ways that I think are less and less accessible these days, where we're kind of expected to, have the funeral, have a few days or a week or two off work, and then go back into work and get on with our lives. And we don't always feel we have a way of speaking about grief, or we don't feel comfortable sharing those emotions perhaps with other people. And so, writing gives us a space and a means to do that, but it also provides that means to keep those stories alive. And those two things drove me when I wrote about my brother, and they were the two kind of instrumental things in writing this book to help others do the same, hopefully.
That leads me very nicely into intentions, actually, because that's something you talk about in the book, examining perhaps your own intentions before embarking on a project like this. And from my own experience, I lost my mum very suddenly a few years ago, very sort of tragically, very suddenly. And I was recommended, actually around similar time to you, as you say, around the 3-month mark, I was sort of recommended journaling as a very early sort of means for, healing practice in those early months, and sort of continuing that conversation with my mother and sharing the things that I would usually share with her in person. But memoir is something different to journaling, isn't it? And what distinguishes memoir from journaling, do you think? And why might someone who's sort of thinking about, writing down these memories or writing down these painful experiences, why might they want to choose one over the other, perhaps?
Yeah, I think it comes down to the fact that I think we return to them for different things. I've done journaling as well, particularly during difficult times, and I found it hugely beneficial because, again, I think one of the great values of writing, whether it's writing memoir or writing stories or journaling in particular, is that it kind of get those thoughts and feelings and emotions and ideas out of our head onto a bit of paper or a document on the laptop. And it stops, to a certain extent, those same thoughts spiraling round and round and round. And we all have that experience of lying in bed at night and unable to get that one thought, one idea or one worry out of our heads. And it kind of separates us from those a little bit, and we're able to sometimes get more of a grip on those through journaling. I say to my students all the time in the writing classroom, also, I sometimes don't know exactly how I feel about something or exactly what I believe about a topic or an issue or an idea until I've been able to articulate it, until I've been able to put it into words. And for me, that means putting it into words and revising and editing it. And for me, that's the distinction between journaling and memoir is the revising and the editing, because I sometimes look back over old journals and I think, well, okay, it was useful to me at the time, but I have no interest in reading this now except as to remind me, what state I was in at this point in time. Whereas I think memoir is something that hopefully want to return to. It records a moment of our lives, even a difficult one, but it also records those precious memories. I mean, I think it's an act of preservation, etymologically, of course. A memoir comes from the same root as memory, to preserve, to keep, to remind. And that, for me, is the kind of crucial goal of this kind of writing. And so I've met so many people, a kind of book tour for this book, who have said, I want to write about a person I've lost, my spouse, my sibling, my parent, my partner, my child, but I don't know where to begin, because I think all of us feel that, that these are three-dimensional, complicated, interesting people, and we want to do justice for them. And we can't always think, well, how do you record a whole life or do justice to this on the page? And we need strategies, we need structures. That's what I try and provide in the book, really different structures and approaches for that have that different intention, I suppose, of recording that person, of preserving those memories to look back on later. My brother died before my daughter was born, but, I want to share something of him and who he was with her. I don't want this to just disappear, and something to go along with those old fading photographs to say this is who he was and this is what he was like, that it can have that personal function in a way that journaling doesn't. Journaling gets us through those difficult times, but it's not something we tend to return to, certainly not repeatedly.
And perhaps less likely to share with someone else. As you say, with a memoir, you might intend to kind of share that with readers and with other audiences.
Exactly, yeah.
It's interesting that you talk about that, that pull between wanting to include, if you're writing about a person, especially someone that you care about, you want to include everything about them and really capture every single aspect of who they were and their life, the life that they led. But you do need to set, when you're writing, we're embarking on a writing project, you do need to set, or it's useful to set goals or limits or parameters for a project. And that would be important in any kind of writing if we want it to feel focused and purposeful, but perhaps even more so when the material is deeply personal and you're writing about someone you care about. And when you were writing about your brother, how did you decide what belonged on the page and what remained private to you? How did you do that how did you set those fences and those limits and those parameters around what you were going to share about him?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I don't think I really did set those parameters when I was writing originally. I think I set those parameters when I was revising and when I was editing. I was drawing from all the many, many, many pages that I'd written about my brother to think, okay, what's going to fit in this book and what's going to be a good illustration of this strategy or this approach or this writing goal. And it was then that I thought, well, yeah, what here am I comfortable, one, sharing with the world, with people who don't know me, and two, what are my parents? What are my family going to be happy about me sharing about us? But when I wrote, I didn't think about that at all. And I tried to not make myself kind of edit as I wrote so that it could be, I suppose, a more beneficial process, more like the journaling that we were speaking about a moment ago. On the book tour, that's a brief segue, I went to Todd Morton Library, which is just outside Manchester, and they have a famous death cafe there where people get together and talk about death rather than, push it into the sidelines and the periphery. And they run these events where people are encouraged to write a letter to the person they've lost, writing not just, the positives, but all the negatives, maybe the unspoken resentments, the arguments that happened, the regrets, putting everything down. And then at the end of these writing sessions, they take all these letters and they put them on a bonfire and have this kind of celebration, burning them. And I thought, I think that's really fantastic too, that sometimes we have to get everything out, but we don't have to share everything. Sometimes the goal is just having done it, And if we then burn it, then, so be it. And that was my approach when writing. And I think it has to be to a certain extent, because otherwise I don't think we're doing justice to the people that we care about and the people we're preserving. There's no such thing as a perfect person. My brother wasn't perfect. I'm certainly not perfect. And, I wanted to be true to that on the page, to not just write a kind of hagiography where I'm, listing all the most wonderful things about him as well. I wanted to dive deep into our arguments, and, as I think anyone who has a sibling knows, you have ferocious arguments growing up.
Of course, yeah.
Teenagers, these are the people that know your triggers, that know the things you hate most about yourself, that know exactly which buttons to press. And, I wanted to honor that relationship, and I couldn't do that if I was going to, I suppose, edit out for all the, embarrassing for me, but also, things that maybe didn't paint him in the best of light. So it was then later on that I went through and thought, well, okay, what am I going to share? What am I not going to share? What's useful in terms of being illustrative for other people going through their own grief and trying to write their way through what they're grappling with? And that's what made me pick certain memories, certain times, but again, certain arguments. I made a choice to include some of the arguments, for example, some of the things we said to each other, some of the regrets that I have, because I think they're important parts of reckoning with grief. But yeah, I also, edited once with my parents in mind, and then edited again with the kind of wider world in mind. But I do still feel I've left a lot of messiness in there, because grief is messy, and a lot of the rawness in there as well. So that people, I think, hopefully have an option. And that's the nature of the book. Every chapter is filled with options. I didn't want to frame it as you should try this or you must try this. It's a set of potential strategies. Some hopefully will be helpful to readers. Some they may feel, okay, this one's not for me. And so one of those is to be completely open and share everything. Again, potentially with the idea of not sharing it after we've written it with other people, but just keeping it for ourselves. So I think it all comes back to that strategy. What are we doing it for? Have we got our eye trained very much on sharing as our main goal? Or is it about articulating what we've been through and who this person really was? And those are different goals. They can be complementary goals, but they're certainly distinct ones.
I'm glad you mentioned the messiness, actually, because that's something I want to come back to shortly in that section about the unknown, which I really, really loved. Yeah, you talk candidly throughout about the challenges of being vulnerable when you're writing, and that temptation to leave out almost like embarrassing or shameful details for ourselves. Can you share a moment in your writing when you chose to sort of lean into something uncomfortable rather than editing it away, and what made you decide to keep it, and why is it important for writers not to retreat from that discomfort too quickly?
Yeah, I mean, I think to answer the last bit of your question first, I think the discomfort is the human bit. I think it's the real bit. It's the bit that connects us with everyone else. I think that's the heart of vulnerability. I've taught workshops and classes on memoir, and particularly, with young students, I do always have a couple who the first thing they write about themselves and their life ends up looking exactly like a LinkedIn post. Humbled to, announce I'm, excited to share. It's essentially all the positive stuff with the real stuff edited out. But, we get enough of that on our phones, on our apps, the edits for just the achievements and just the fancy meals and the holidays and all the things we choose to share. And I think what draws us to good writing, whether it's fiction, memoir, poetry, is, I think, a rawness, is a kind of messiness. And I did want to lean into that. I chose to open the book, the very first chapter, with a kind of slightly embarrassing escapade of running around supermarket in chase of a guy who I thought was my brother, because he seemed from the back, from his haircut and the shirt he was wearing, to look just like him. And of course, it wasn't him at all, because he died 2 weeks before. And I wanted to show that kind of confusing messiness, the way grief breaks reality. And I thought, well, if I've done that, I have to go all in. I can't, tell people that there's a value, both, an artistic value in vulnerability, but artistic because it connects, because it builds our connection with readers, with other people. That's often why we read, to make those connections. So I leaned into that, I would say, particularly in the third chapter, which I called Setting Myself on Fire, about kind of writing lowest ebbs. Yeah, and I had a lot of qualms about keeping that one in. I went back and forth because I thought, my boss is going to read this. We're going to read this. It's a chapter about kind of months after my brother died, kind of drinking too much and kind of hiding, doing kind of drinks without other people noticing, heading to town on my own drunk, the kind of goal of getting in some kind of fight, which didn't happen, fortunately. Completely humiliating experiences, really, where I look back and I want to cringe, really, and hide my head in my hands, just kind of talking about it. But this is what makes us human. This is what is real about grief. But it's also, I think, proof of love, I suppose, and proof of how much my brother meant to me. Because if he hadn't meant so much to me, I wouldn't have had so much trouble knowing how to deal with these emotions and trying to push these emotions away, or pushing myself into these self-destructive habits, because it broke me so much. I had no other clue how to deal with it, how to respond. And again, that brings us full circle to writing the book, right? Because I think that's true of a lot of people. I was reading a study done in the US, but I think we could generalize it, that says, a study done in 2022 that suggested that 1 in 7 adult men has no friends at all.
Wow.
No one to talk to. And I think even if we do have friends, even if we're not in that kind of difficult position, we might not feel comfortable burdening them with all of our emotions. And certainly we may have grown up and been socialized to not overshare, or not to cry in public, or not to let out all of these messy, difficult, hard to deal with emotions. And so where do we take them? What's the place where we can deal with them? We don't have these kind of rituals anymore, where, like we had in the kind of Victorian days, where you knew for 6 months you would wear black and everyone would see that and know you were in mourning. And then you'd slowly add a little bit of color or change material bit by bit as you kind of reintegrated into society. We have none of that. And so for me, the space really was the page, to be able to write and explore. For other people, I met many people who, process grief through art, through painting, through music, through all different forms of expression. For me, it's writing. And I think for many people, having the opportunity to express and explore on the page without judgment is vital, because I think we've got fewer and fewer venues or avenues to do that in kind of today's world.
When you've put those difficult memories, those embarrassing moments onto paper, has it changed your relationship to them, your memory of them?
Yeah, I think it has. I mean, and that's also one of my worries in the book that I address in it. I address, near the beginning, 2 big worries. Number one, that writing is going to be triggering, that it's going to be re-traumatizing. number two, that by writing, we kind of almost replace the memory, right? That once it's on the page, it's kind of fixed and it's there, and we don't have to think about it so much, and we don't have to recall so much because it's there on the page. So our relationship with that memory changes. And yeah, I address the kind of theories and, psychological discussion of those in the book. But for me, those changes were almost always positive ones, whereby, I got a little bit of perspective, I think. And I feel like I understood my brother a little by writing more and more about him. And I certainly understood myself a bit better. And, I think one of the truths of the world is, I think we hear all the time these days, I certainly do, about people saying you've got to practice self-care. And I think that's absolutely true, but I know for a fact that at the same time, it's very easy to take care of other people we love, people we care about, our kids, our family, our friends. And we show them a degree of care and of grace and of forgiveness that most of us would never, ever apply to ourselves. And we're so much harsher in judging ourselves, in pushing us. And I feel like I maybe got a different perspective on myself and my actions and was able to say, well, okay, this is who I am. And maybe I do need to be a little forgiving or a little understanding of myself rather than holding myself to a different standard, which I think, most of us are guilty of all the time.
Absolutely, yeah. You mentioned truth there, and I think, one of those sort of big concerns that comes, is explored in the book and is something that I've thought about when I'm writing and talking is that idea of sharing our truth and being, accurate. What do you think truth means in the context of, writing memoir? How important is, say factual truth versus emotional truth? Because truth can change, can't it? Something can be true in the moment when you're writing about it, but as you say, it might change later on.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think it's important sometimes to draw those distinctions, that there are personal truths and emotional truths, and there are factual truths. I mean, I try to encourage a kind of range of approaches in the book so that people can draw from these different truths, so to speak. I've got a chapter about the kind of research that we might do, talking to other people. I talked to my brother's friends, people he was at school with, people that I knew and people that I didn't know that I was kind of meeting for the first time. I talked to my parents, especially. That was interesting when I found their memory of an event was completely different to mine. I did the kind of online research to newspaper databases to find, what were the big newspaper stories on the day he was born? What was the weather actually like during this, snowy winter that I remember and keep coming back to in the book and appears in the kind of final chapter, in order to not have it just be the kind of personal truth of memory. Having said all of that, at the same time, I think anyone who writes and grapples with memoir has to accept that we're, it's the kind of spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law, so to speak, that we're getting to the spirit of how things happened and of how someone was, rather than the actual literal truth. That's kind of self-evident in a way. If I try to write down right now a conversation, I had with my colleague yesterday, just 24 hours ago, it's not going to be word perfect. Recalling things that happened when I was 6, 7, 8, and so on, there has to be a degree of invention. But I'm trying to recreate as close to what happened as possible. Again, there I think it's useful and instructive to draw from the kind of toolbox of fiction, how we dramatize, how we bring events to life. Before this book, all my other books of creative writing have been historical fiction. So I've been thinking for a long time about how do we bring the past to life? How do we create and invent conversations, invent details to make things authentic, make things real, and be true to what happened without obviously being able to report the exact words spoken at exact moment. And I think that's the tightrope that we have to walk as memoir writers. And I think the only way to do it is by continually kind of reflecting on it and going back and analyzing and saying, is there another perspective to this? Who can I talk to about this? Are there other ways of looking at it? How important here is my personal truth, my emotional truth versus the facts of what happened. And I think you can't write memoir without reflecting. It's part of the process, and hopefully it's a beneficial and useful part of the process as well. But I mean, I struggled with that. I think anyone writing about the past struggles with that. I wanted to have a space in the book for my brother to speak back, to hear from him. I went back through some of his old writings, messages, old school books, and tried to throw in as much of that as possible. Again, to give a flavor rather than to give the whole side of him. But I was very conscious of the fact that, it's always lopsided. And I think all we can do is acknowledge that and continue to reflect on it as we do it.
Yeah, embracing the inconsistencies, I guess, of memory and the messiness that you referred to before, and the ways that we change our minds about the past. I guess. I mean, that is a truth, isn't it?
The messiness, the imperfections of it, the gaps, the holes, the fragments. Yeah, it has to be a part of it.
And you mentioned there about when people remember the same event differently, and were there any tensions in the book when you were writing when you were trying to sort of portray an event and people having different memories of that? How do you navigate that responsibly? And were you ever thinking about that in your writing?
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking about that in my writing. And I think it's very difficult. I mean, it's difficult with writing about people we've lost because we can't check with them. We can't run it by. I think that's a huge responsibility, and that's the one that I found daunting. I was able to speak to my parents and to say, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? And, sometimes they said, my mum in particular said, why have you written about, growing up in this little red brick house? We never lived in a red brick house. It was grey. And that was the one detail that leapt out to her, that no, we'd never lived in a house like that. But in my mind's eye, that's the colour I see when I picture that house that we were in as kids. But beyond that small detail, my parents were, I think, very understanding of the project and saying, well, that's not how we remember it, but it's not so far from the truth as we remember it that it's problematic. And I think it's good to have those different sides. I've tried to include some contrast where people do remember things differently in the book. My big struggle was, what would my brother have said? This didn't happen at all. It wasn't like that. You're misinterpreting. And I think he would, absolutely. And at those points where I think he might have said that, I've tried to throw that into the book to keep his voice intact, so to speak. And I think, again, to continually acknowledge that's the nature of memoir. It is not historical document in and of itself. It's not a definitive statement of record. It is, a highly subjective, highly personal sense of how we experience life, how we experience the world, how we interacted with a person and what they mean to us. And I think for partly that reason, I chose lots of experiences that were, I suppose, small scale in that they involved one or two or three people that were very focused and that I feel fairly certain about, and I've been able to corroborate a little bit, but where I haven't, I do believe they're true to the spirit of who we were then and the kind of things we were doing.
And one of the chapters that really stayed with me in this book was your exploration of fable and myth as well, and the ways that they can be used to sort of reach an emotional truth, and actually how, there is a place for imagination in memoir. Could you talk a little bit about that and what, fiction or imagination allowed you to access that sort of straightforward realism perhaps couldn't?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was, again, part of my intention with the book, to give people different strategies, different ways in. There's another chapter as well on, poetic tools, using poetry instead. But I think, with the fiction, I think it does two things. One, it acknowledges that memoir is or contains some degree of artifice that we are constructing, even if that's just putting a structure on a memory and saying, okay, this is when this experience started, this is when it ended, and fitting it in that neat kind of narrative box. But and acknowledging, okay, we are creating, we are inventing a little bit. But also I think it's freeing to be able to use those fictional tools and to get out some of the, I suppose, deeper and sometimes richer psychological truths of how we live or how we approach the world, that kind of personal mythos of, what we may have felt as kids. And I wanted to explore my brother's frustrations and his approach to the world as though, he was a character, not just a character, actually the central character, the protagonist of a fairy tale, and it was really fun to write it because I wasn't trying to remember exactly. I was trying to fit all of what I knew of him in a new mode, and that kind of being freed from the kind of tight confines of realism. Let me play and explore and kind of keep going with Luke, and it kind of, Luke is my brother, of having these kind of almost conversations with him, of having these negotiations with him, of these hypotheticals, how would he have behaved? And I think it allowed me to explore a different side of him without having to link it to particular memories and occasions, but just to show these hundreds of other sides that we all have, and these personal mythologies, and the way we see ourselves as central characters in the bigger stories or myths of our lives. And it was so beneficial for me that I thought I've got to make a chapter around that.
Yeah, you can I really sense that playfulness and that sense of fun actually in that chapter. And, you mentioned before that idea of wonder, and actually, writing about grief and about difficult experiences won't always be hard. There is absolutely room for a sense of experimentation and invention and playfulness, isn't there? That's something that people shouldn't be worried about embracing.
Absolutely, because I think that's part of grappling with something creatively. I suppose that it brings that's historical fiction as well, right? It brings the past into the present. It makes it vivid and alive and real now. And that's also memoir. I think it brings the past, it brings people we've lost into the present. We're engaging with them in the here and now. And I think that is fun. I think there is a pleasure. I took a deep pleasure in almost all of writing the book. I don't think that's always the same as saying it made me happy. I think,
of course,
they're distinct things. But there was a rich and a deeper happiness, and sometimes a pleasure rather, or sometimes a more just joyful pleasure of seeing my brother, in my mind's eye, and capturing some of that in the description and seeing him in action, so to speak.
It bears similarities, I think, to that. I'm sure lots of people do this. The conversations I have in my head all the time with my mother, as if she were there with me, and I'm kind of imagining what she would say in certain circumstances, or, what her response would be if I updated her about something I was doing. And there's a kind of, sometimes it's a little bit raw and melancholic, but actually it's part of the sort of the joy of still having her with me.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's part of the tapestry of our lives. I mean, I talk in, I think, the second chapter of the book, right near the beginning, about the fact that grief kind of does double duty, right? We lose someone we care deeply about and we're grieving that person, but we also lose something of ourselves. You know, there's a hole inside of us. Social cognitivists thought they would call that the relational role. And, there's some theorists that suggest that's what our self is, our identity, or self-concept, as it's often referred to in the psychological literature. That's what our self-concept is. It's made up of this different web of roles that we play, father, son, friend, colleague, brother. And when we lose one of those roles, we lose an aspect of our identity and we struggle to kind of renegotiate that. And what we often end up doing, and I think for clear reason, is wanting to keep that alive as well as keep the person alive, because the people we care about are fundamentally a part of ourselves, and it's impossible to completely unstitch them from who we are and from our personal histories and from how we live.
And in a bid to wrap up our conversation nicely into a bow, you spoke before about embracing uncertainty and sort of resisting that urge to, force neat conclusions onto things that don't, especially in memoir, things don't tie up into a neat bow, and even more so in the context of grief. There's so much there in that experience of losing someone that we just don't get to resolve. So when writing this book, when you were sort of approaching the end and going through the editing process and attempting to finalize it, did you feel that pull to tidy things up? And what would you say to people who are thinking in their mind's eye, actually I need to somehow find a clear conclusion to this book that I'm writing?
Yeah, I think that's a really complex question, actually, because I'm reminded really of several things that I dislike, and I suppose tried to swerve against. I dislike the kind of. I hope you don't mind me just listing a few things I dislike here.
Not at all. Please do.
We'll get to the question. One thing I learned, the more kind of psychology and the more kind of academic study of grief I did, the more I disliked the classical model many people know as the 5 stages of grief. It's technically called the Kubler-Ross model, which suggests, we go through anger and then denial and then bargaining. And not only is it psychologically disproved, but it goes against my experience and the experience of everyone else. Really,
I hated that as well.
Because
that wound me up.
There is no one model for grief. There is as many types of grief as there are people. And, I've lost other people besides my brother. And the harsh and difficult truth is we will all go through grief many times in our lives. It's an unavoidable fact of being human, and it's different every time. And everyone's grief journey is different. And grief is not linear either. It's not like when we go through a difficult breakup or a divorce and things are terrible for many months, but then they get gradually better until we, feel put together enough to let our friends drag us out to meet someone new and start on a new relationship. Grief's not linear like that. There is no straightforward path, It's more of a kind of topsy-turvy roller coaster, even now, even after writing the book, even, many, many years after my brother's died, I could be having a good day and I can hear, one of his favorite songs come up on, shuffle, or in a movie, I can, see someone who looks a bit like him. I can smell someone wearing the aftershave he used to wear. And I'm suddenly right back in the kind of deep pain and sadness and rawness of when he died. So there's no one model. So I wanted to avoid this idea that also we get closure. I don't like that word. I don't use it in the book. I didn't want to frame this book as, writing through grief, because that kind of implies we get to the end and then we're done with it. And then, okay, we're healed and wonderful. Great. Everything's done. Because I don't think it works like that either. I think we carry it around with us forever, but I think in different forms. And I think we learn to live with grief and learn to incorporate it in our lives in different ways. And one of the things I learned through my writing, that one thing you can't do is run away from it, bury your head in the sand. And so I wanted to, not give some kind of neat little bow of tying up every loose end, because that's not possible. I mean, another thing that I hate is the publisher, fortunately, were very good and very generous in saying to me, well, what are you thinking about for the cover? What would you like? And I said to them, I know what I don't want. I don't want, someone with their head in their hands, or, silhouette, or someone tearful or leaning their head against a window and rain's beating against the window. And I don't want, two figures hand in hand, walking off towards a sunset together, that full sense of ending, of everything's okay in the end. Unfortunately, I got a wonderful cover, and hoping, some of you listeners may Google it and have a look, and obviously also hopefully be tempted to read it too. But it's a beautiful, colourful cover because, of the joy, but also because, grief goes on, but it goes on in different ways. So I have the last chapter about endings, and I talk about my experience of living with grief, of carrying my brother with me, of trying to honour and preserve his memories, of trying to not forget about him and not brush him aside, but also not feel like I'm completely stuck. I think we have a duty to keep going for the people that are no longer with us. And I think that impels us forward. I write a little bit about, writing into the future, writing about where we go next. And I think for me, that's more interesting than trying to have an ending that ties everything together and says, okay, my grief journey is done. But that asks instead, okay, well, where next?
Yeah. And that's something, that applies to writing, and it absolutely applies to the relationship that you have with that person, doesn't it? I always try and think of, my relationship with my mother as this is like a next chapter, and it's a chapter that looks different to what I expected, but it's not an ending because there's no, she's not no longer my mother. He's not no longer your brother, is he? It's just is that your relationship's taking a different form and a next chapter going forward.
Exactly, yeah.
And to finish, I'd love to return to the word wonder, which is in the title of the book. And again, for me personally, grief is, yes, the most painful aspects of being alive, but also I have experienced more moments of sort of magic and wonder, creatively or just in my day-to-day life or with, my relationships to other people in the past couple of years since losing my mum than I ever had before. Like there's a whole new chapter in my life of sort of discovery, really. Having written this book and having, shaped some of your grief into a story, as it were, what sense of wonder has been left with you?
Well, I think, what you just said perfectly resonates with me. This sense that my experiences, even with my brother, that go on, that I think about him and I remember him, there is a wonder to that, to thinking about our times together and to keeping that alive in me. And exactly the same as with you, my experiences with other people of especially when I've been able to push past all my reservations and all my deeply embedded, fears of opening up and being vulnerable and sharing stories about grief. And all the people I've talked to on this book tour and the readings I've done, there is, a sense of wonder, of magic, as you mentioned, everyone who is interested in grief memoir will, know and sing the praises of the wonderful book by Joan Didion, the magical thinking, and the sense that you think about reality, about time, about our place in the world, about our relationship with each other differently. And I don't mean that, in a kind of traditional, ghostly type way, but I mean it in a new kind of, I suppose, appreciation, but also a sense of, like we talked about with endings, maybe not having to tie everything together, not having to know or be certain about everything, not having to be fine all the time, not having to be only presenting the positives as we're encouraged to do on Instagram and LinkedIn and everywhere else. But just the sheer wonder of the things we get to experience with the people we care about, and just those central magical joys. Absolutely.
And has writing this book and writing about your brother, do you think that's shaped that next chapter of your relationship with him? Has that had an impact on you?
Absolutely, yeah. I'm not afraid of those memories that used to creep up on me in a way that I was in the months after he died. That I thought I'm going to be spiraling if I look back on all that I've lost, all the things I never said. Partly a book is giving me a chance to say them. It keeps that communication alive, albeit one-sided to a certain extent, but it keeps that connection going, and it keeps evolving, it keeps changing. I think about my brother and myself in different ways as I kind of move forward, and I continue writing about him, writing about my life, and thinking about him. And I think the experience of writing the book in particular has in some ways strengthened that, because I go out and I talk to people about my brother all the time instead of afraid to mention him for fear that I'm going to break down in tears or embarrass myself. And so he's here with me in that way. He's still being talked about. He's still being remembered. He's still beside me.
Thank you, Sam. I hope everyone, if they haven't done so already, reads Wonder and Loss, because I really do think it's remarkable. And, whether you're a writer, not necessarily a memoir writer, I think there's lots in there that can be applied to, other forms of writing, or just as someone interested in reading about that experience of grief and of shaping it into storytelling. I think it's a really, really wonderful book. What's next for you? Have you got any other projects on the horizon at the moment?
Yes, I mean, next is I've turned back to fiction, but I'm trying to do the same thing, I suppose, which is bridge together what I am interested in from a kind of scholarly point of view and what I'm interested in a creative point of view. So I've been doing a lot of research projects recently with a neuropsychologist, thinking about how trauma impacts how we think and talk about our lives. Trauma as something that impacts our storytelling and the stories we tell. And at the moment, I'm in the process of turning that into a novel that explores, the ways damage to our brain can impact the stories we tell and how those impact the people around us.
That sounds fascinating. I will certainly be reading that. Thank you so much for your time, Sam.
A big thank you to Sam and Steph for their time. Make sure that you pick up a copy of Wonder and Loss from your local bookshop or library.
Such a lovely time talking to Sam.
You can hear that.
Wonderful man. If you have any questions or you want to get in touch, you can find us at Writers Centre on Instagram and Blue Sky. We're on Facebook, and you can sign up to the NCW newsletter at nationalcentreforwriting.org.uk.
As a UK registered charity, we rely on the generosity of our supporters to make our work possible. You can make a donation on the website by going to the Support Us page, or wait until the 17th of March and join in our Big Give campaign, even better.
If you enjoyed what you heard today, please do consider subscribing to the podcast and leaving us a 5-star rating and review, because this helps other writers to find us.
Thanks again. Keep writing, and we will catch you on the next episode.